I'm going to walk through how to build a Cujo. Some small things have changed, but this is a great starting point. I print a drilling template on a sticker and stick it to the box. I use a 3/8 drill bit to drill out the hole for the potentiometer. I use 11/32 to drill for the 510. And I use a 1/2 inch to drill out for the switch. I use a 1/4 inch drill bit to drill out for the magnets on the lid. I leave a little small lip so that the magnets will sit flush and not fall through. I use a cheap mill vise mounted on a drill press to mill out for the screen bezels. This is just a rough cut. I use a bench grinder to grind off the tabs on the battery sled. Then I grind off the top so that it sits flush. I grind out a notch on the bottom right corner and then grind off the other side. I use a fine wire wheel to take off the factory coating on the box. I use an arbor press to press each of the 4 magnets into place, making sure that they are properly aligned. On these 510s, which I don't use anymore, I use a small Allen wrench to press out the center pin and insulator. I push the potentiometer through a piece of painter's tape. And then trim it to fit. I set the 510 in place and then hammer it down lightly. I use JB Weld, mix it up on a post-it note with a toothpick, and slather it all over everything inside the box to keep it all in place. I use a cut-up business card and rubber band to keep the potentiometer from pushing out and not being level. I cut out some mirrored window tint film for screen covers. I set the button in and then epoxy in place and hold that in place with a rubber band. I take a small chunk off the battery sled so that my wires will fit underneath the tabs. Put some solder on my wire. Slide it in place, and then solder them to the battery tabs. I cover the back side of the battery sleds with liquid electrical tape. just to make sure it doesn't have any kind of shorts. I placed a screen cover over the screen and slide it into place inside the bezel that I forgot to show you how to put in. I then epoxy the screen into place. I then epoxy my battery sled and set it into place. I cut my wires for my 510 center pins. I heat up the center pin, add some solder inside, add some solder to the wire, and solder that into the center pin. I bend my 1000 ohm resistors into what I like. I use small tweezers to pull out the pins on the OKR chip, just so it's easier to work with. I then put some solder on each of the pins on the OKR and solder my 1000 ohm resistor into place. I then solder my 220 ohm resistor on. And my Zener diode. I solder my gate, drain, and source wires onto my P-channel MOSFET and solder each of the wires onto my 510. I use green for the trim, red for the output, black for ground, red for input, and white for the remote sense input. I cover everything with shrink tubing. Here I didn't actually use it on all of the wires, but I changed that later. I cover everything. I cover the chip with shrink tubing. And also the P-channel MOSFET. And shrink it all down with a heat gun. I put solder onto all the points inside that will take wires. The battery tabs, the potentiometer, the 510, and the switch. I forgot to mention the battery labels. They're just printed, cut to fit, and then placed in with double-sided tape. I solder my ground wire from the battery sled to the pot, and then from the 510 to the battery sled. I slide my 510 positive wire and center pin down into the box. Wiggle it in place, then press it in with my Allen wrench. I solder the ground wire for my screen onto the battery sled. I solder the P-channel MOSFET into place on the switch. And onto the battery sled as well, for both positive and negative. Solder the positive input for my OKR onto the same tab the P-channel MOSFET went onto. I solder the trim to the potentiometer. Solder the negative to the battery sled. Push everything into place. I solder my white wire onto the other tab of my switch, slide everything into place. Snip it off, strip it. Now hold everything in place with an alligator clip and then tweezers and solder each of these together. This is the positive for the screen, the positive output on the chip, and the output to the 510. Then use 2 layers of shrink wrap and cover all of that. I take some pliers and bend the tabs on the positive side of the battery sled so that it won't tear up the wrapping on the batteries, and then pull out the negative side so they sit nice and tight. Now pop in some batteries and give it a test. I check low voltage and high voltage. Then epoxy the magnets onto the lid, making sure they're in the correct orientation. And do this for all 4 sides. And then check each one on the box to make sure it's right. And that's how I build a Cujo. Just a simple test. In my messy living room. Thanks.